"You're in the wrong room," the man said without even looking up, his voice cutting through the polished silence like it belonged there more than she ever could. And for a second the entire boardroom followed his lead, eyes skimming over Naomi Carter as if she were part of the furniture. Just another body in a faded lab coat, standing too close to power, too close to people who had spent decades making sure people like her stayed invisible. The soft hum of the overhead lights reflecting off the glass table, the faint scent of expensive cologne mixing with antiseptic. Everything sharp, controlled, rehearsed, except her presence, which seemed to disrupt the symmetry of the room without her saying a word. Someone slid a white porcelain mug across the table, not even glancing at her face, just the coat. Always the coat, as if that alone defined her place. "Coffee's empty," another voice added casually, like assigning her purpose, like it was obvious, like it was already decided. Naomi didn't move, not right away, her fingers tightening slightly around the folder she carried, the paper edges pressing into her skin, grounding her, reminding her why she was here, not for them, not for their approval, but for something far more fragile than their egos. The patient file inside that folder, a name, a heartbeat, a life hanging quietly in the balance while this room debated numbers and reputations. She stepped forward instead of reaching for the mug. One step, measured, deliberate. The kind that didn't ask for permission, and the room felt it before anyone acknowledged it. The subtle shift, the disruption, like a single note played off-key in a perfectly tuned orchestra. Heads turned now, not dismissive but curious, irritated, alert. And then she spoke, calm, steady, her voice not loud but precise enough to cut through every whispered assumption. "The dosage on page 3 is off by 12 milligrams. The words landed clean, surgical, and for a fraction of a second, no one reacted, like the room needed to process the audacity before the content. A few glances exchanged. Someone leaned closer to the screen. Another scoffed softly. The man who had spoken first finally looked up, his eyes narrowing, not in concern but in challenge, as if the idea that she could be right was less acceptable than the possibility that something was wrong. "Excuse me," he said, slow, controlled, the temperature in the room dropping just enough to be felt in the bones. Naomi didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't apologize for existing in a space that had never intended to make room for her. "The calculation," she continued, her eyes on the data, not on them. "If you proceed with that dosage, the patient's risk increases significantly." Silence stretched, thin and fragile, the kind that could snap at any second. And then the reactions came, not thoughtful, not cautious, but defensive, dismissive, a ripple of discomfort masked as authority. Chairs shifted, someone chuckled under their breath, another leaned back with a shake of the head. The man at the head of the table straightened, his presence filling the space like a wall closing in. "You don't speak in this meeting," he said, each word deliberate, final, as if ending something before it could begin. And just like that, the room realigned around him, power snapping back into place, eyes turning away from her, dismissing the interruption, restoring order. But Naomi didn't move, not yet, because somewhere beneath the polished table, beneath the tailored suits and controlled voices, the truth was still there, quiet, waiting. And she knew it wouldn't stay buried for long. The room did not erupt. It tightened, like something invisible had been pulled too far and might snap if touched again. Naomi could feel it in the way the air pressed heavier against her lungs, in the way no one reached for the screen, yet everyone avoided looking at her, as if ignoring her would undo what she had said. The man at the head of the table, Dr. Richard Whitmore, adjusted his cufflinks slowly, deliberately, a small motion that somehow carried more authority than any raised voice. His silver watch catching the overhead light, reflecting a cold, precise glow across the polished surface. "This discussion is above your level," he said, not loud, but absolute. The kind of statement that did not expect a reply, the kind that usually ended conversations before they began. A few heads nodded, relieved to return to something familiar, controlled, predictable. Someone near the far end of the table tapped a tablet, pretending to review the file, but not long enough to actually question it. The rhythm of the meeting trying to reset itself, trying to move forward, but something was off now, subtle, but undeniable, like a faint ringing after a loud noise. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, not retreating, not advancing, just holding her place in a room that had not been built to include her. Her eyes moved back to the screen, to the line she had seen within seconds that others had overlooked for weeks, maybe months, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they trusted the system too much to question it, trusted each other too much to look twice. If the patient weighs 160 pounds, she said quietly, her voice threading through the silence again. The current dosage exceeds the recommended range by nearly 10%. This time, someone did look, a younger doctor, barely shifting forward in his chair, his brow tightening as he scrolled, his finger pausing mid-motion, just long enough to plant doubt. Whitmore noticed it instantly, his gaze snapping toward him, not angry, not yet, but sharp enough to pull him back. "We are not revisiting the calculation," Whitmore said, the edge in his tone clearer now, not because he had checked the numbers, but because control was slipping, even if only by an inch. Naomi could feel the shift, small but real, like a door cracking open in a sealed room. And she knew this was the moment that decided everything. Not the data, not the truth, but whether anyone would be willing to look at it. Her fingers loosened around the folder, and she placed it gently on the table, the soft sound drawing more attention than any raised voice could have. A few eyes flicked toward it, then to her, then back to Whitmore. Waiting, always waiting. "I ran the numbers twice," she added, not defensive, not emotional, just certain, the kind of certainty that did not beg to be believed. It simply existed. Whitmore exhaled slowly, his patience thinning, his authority challenged in a way that could not be ignored anymore. "Security will escort you out if you continue," he said, the words calm but final. And this time, the door at the back of the room opened slightly, just enough for the presence of someone waiting to be felt, a quiet reminder of how easily people could be removed from places like this. Naomi heard it. Everyone did. But she did not turn, did not acknowledge it, because the truth had already entered the room, and whether they chose to face it or not was no longer entirely in their control. Across the table, the younger doctor hesitated again, his eyes fixed on the screen, his lips parting slightly as if about to speak, then stopping, caught between authority and doubt. And in that fragile, suspended moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, not because of Naomi, but because something deeper had begun to shift, something that could not be pushed back into silence as easily as before. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the table like a thin layer of ice no one wanted to step on. Naomi could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system above, steady and indifferent, a reminder that the world outside this room continued without hesitation, while inside everything had slowed to a fragile standstill. The security officer remained just beyond the doorway, not entering, not interrupting, simply waiting for a signal that had not come yet. Whitmore's gaze stayed fixed on Naomi, calculating now, no longer dismissive but unwilling to concede even the smallest shift in control. His fingers tapped once against the table, a subtle rhythm that signaled impatience rather than uncertainty. "We are moving forward," he said, turning slightly back toward the screen as if the decision had already been finalized, as if her words had never landed. But across the table, the younger doctor did not look away this time. His hand hovered over the tablet, then moved, scrolling back to the exact line Naomi had pointed out, slower now, more deliberate, his jaw tightening as he recalculated in silence, one number at a time. The room noticed it, not openly, but in the way shoulders stiffened, in the way a few eyes drifted back to the screen despite themselves. Doubt had entered, and it did not need permission to stay. Naomi remained still, her posture steady, her breathing controlled, not pushing, not repeating herself, because she understood something they did not. That truth did not need volume. It only needed time, and time had just begun to turn in her favor. The younger doctor's fingers paused mid-scroll, his eyes narrowing as the numbers aligned in a way that did not match the original conclusion. A small shift in expression, barely visible, but enough to change the air again. "Dr. Whitmore," he began carefully, his voice lower than before, measured, as if testing the weight of each word before letting it fall. Whitmore did not turn immediately, but the slight tightening of his jaw gave him away. He had heard it. He had felt it, the crack forming in the certainty he had built around himself. "What is it?" Whitmore replied, controlled, but sharper now. The younger doctor hesitated for half a second, just long enough for the entire room to lean into that moment without moving. The recalculation, he said, eyes still on the screen. There might be a discrepancy. The word hung in the air, small but dangerous, like a spark near dry paper. A few heads turned more openly now, no longer pretending not to listen, no longer pretending the interruption had ended. Whitmore finally shifted his gaze back to the display, slower this time, his confidence forcing him to remain composed even as the ground beneath it shifted. He leaned forward slightly, scanning the numbers himself, and for the first time since Naomi had spoken, he did not immediately respond. The silence that followed was different now, no longer dismissive, no longer controlled, but searching, uncertain. Naomi watched it unfold without expression, not because she felt nothing, but because she had learned long ago that the moment truth reveals itself is not loud. It is quiet, almost invisible, until suddenly it is undeniable. And as Whitmore's eyes moved across the data, pausing longer than before, the room understood something without anyone saying it out loud. The conversation had changed, the power had shifted, and it was no longer entirely his to command. Whitmore did not speak right away, and that was the first signal that something had truly shifted, because men like him always had an answer, always had control, always filled silence before it could question them. But now his eyes remained fixed on the screen, scanning, recalculating, his fingers hovering just above the table as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. The younger doctor leaned in further, his tablet angled slightly toward Whitmore, not in defiance, but in quiet insistence. If the patient's weight is 160 pounds, the safe range caps lower than what is listed here, he said, more confident now, the hesitation fading as the math confirmed itself. A second doctor across the table shifted in his chair, pulling the document closer, his brow tightening as he followed the same trail. The room was no longer aligned. It was dividing, not loudly, not dramatically, but in subtle movements, in shifting attention, in the quiet recalculations happening behind composed expressions. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her breathing steady, her gaze calm, not searching for validation, not pushing for acknowledgement, because she understood that once doubt enters a room like this, it does not leave quietly, it grows. Whitmore finally leaned back slightly, his jaw set, his posture still controlled but no longer effortless. "We have reviewed this case thoroughly," he said, though the certainty in his tone had thinned, stretched just enough to be noticed. "The projections account for variability." But even as he spoke, his eyes flicked back to the numbers, just for a fraction of a second, long enough to betray that he was no longer entirely sure. The younger doctor did not look away this time, respectfully. "The variance does not cover a 10% increase at that threshold," he replied, his voice careful but firm, and that word, respectfully, carried weight, not submission, but boundary, a line drawn with precision. The room absorbed it, some leaning forward now, others no longer pretending to disengage. The balance was tipping, slowly but undeniably. Naomi reached into her folder then, not abruptly, not to interrupt, but with quiet intention, and placed a single printed sheet beside the tablet, aligning it neatly with the edge of the table. The motion small, controlled, but impossible to ignore. A few eyes dropped to it immediately, drawn not by her, but by the clarity of what she had brought. "This is the standard protocol from the National Clinical Guidelines, updated last quarter," she said, her voice even, measured, not louder, just clearer. The dosage adjustment was revised based on new risk data. No emotion, no accusation, just information, clean and undeniable. Whitmore's gaze moved to the paper, then back to the screen, then to Naomi, and for the first time there was something new in his expression, not anger, not dismissal, but resistance meeting reality. The kind that could hold for a moment, but not forever. The second doctor nodded slowly as he read, almost unconsciously, as if the data had already made the decision for him. "This aligns with the updated advisory," he said quietly, and that was it. The point where silence no longer protected authority, the point where truth began to speak through more than one voice. Whitmore exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath that carried more weight than any raised voice could, his fingers pressing lightly against the table now, grounding himself in a position that was no longer absolute. The room waited, not for Naomi, but for him, for how he would respond, for whether he would hold the line or acknowledge the shift that everyone could now feel. And in that suspended moment, the power that had once seemed immovable began to fracture, not with noise, but with quiet, undeniable certainty. Whitmore's silence stretched just a fraction too long, and in a room built on certainty, that was all it took for tension to sharpen into something undeniable. His fingers pressed flatter against the table now, not tapping anymore, not signaling control, but holding it in place. These guidelines are subject to interpretation, he said finally, his voice steady but carrying a weight that no longer felt absolute, as if he were reinforcing a position that had already begun to shift beneath him. A few heads nodded at first, out of habit more than agreement, but the movement was weaker, slower, less unified than before. The younger doctor did not respond immediately, his eyes still scanning the printed sheet Naomi had placed down, his lips pressed together as if choosing carefully between caution and truth. And then he spoke, quieter than before but clearer. "The revision is not ambiguous," he said, his finger tracing the line on the page. "It specifically addresses cases within this weight range." Another pause followed, but this one felt different, no longer fragile, no longer waiting for permission, but gathering, expanding. The second doctor leaned forward again, adjusting his glasses slightly as he read the same section. "He is right," he added, almost to himself, but loud enough for the room to hear. And just like that, the balance shifted further, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that it could not be ignored. Naomi felt it without moving. The subtle redistribution of attention, the way eyes no longer dismissed her presence but returned to the data she had introduced, the way the room no longer revolved solely around Whitmore's voice. Whitmore inhaled slowly, his shoulders remaining squared, his posture still composed, but the effort behind it now visible in the tightening of his jaw. "Even if there is a marginal discrepancy," he said, choosing each word with precision, "it does not invalidate the overall procedure." The statement landed, but it did not settle the room the way it would have earlier. It hovered, questioned, weighed against the growing evidence that no longer belonged to just one perspective. Naomi spoke again then, not louder, not sharper, just present. "It is not marginal if it increases the patient's risk beyond the accepted threshold." Her voice remained calm, anchored, not challenging him directly, but refusing to bend around the truth. The words did not clash with his. They simply stood beside them. And that contrast made the difference impossible to ignore. The younger doctor nodded once, more openly now. "If we proceed without adjustment, we are knowingly exceeding safe parameters," he said. And there it was, the line that could not be stepped back from. The room absorbed it in silence, heavier now, more grounded. Whitmore's gaze shifted again, from the screen to the paper, then finally to Naomi, holding there longer than before, studying not just her presence but the position she now occupied in the room, a position he had not granted but could no longer deny. The security officer at the door remained still, unnoticed now, irrelevant to the conversation that had outgrown the idea of removing her. No one looked toward the door anymore. No one waited for that outcome, because something else had taken its place, something larger than authority, larger than hierarchy. The quiet, steady rise of undeniable truth. Whitmore exhaled again, slower this time, and for the first time since the meeting began, he did not immediately speak, because the room was no longer waiting for him to restore order. It was waiting for him to recognize that it had already changed. The room settled into a silence that no longer belonged to authority, but to realization, a quieter, heavier kind that pressed against every surface, every breath. Naomi could hear the faint ticking of a wall clock somewhere behind the glass panels, steady and indifferent, marking time as if this moment was just another second. But inside the room, everything had slowed, stretched, as if the weight of what had just shifted needed space to fully land. Whitmore remained still, his gaze no longer scanning for errors but lingering on the same line he had dismissed minutes ago. The numbers did not change under scrutiny. They held, firm and unyielding, and that was what made them dangerous. not their complexity, but their clarity. Across the table, the younger doctor leaned back slightly, not in retreat, but in quiet confirmation. His expression no longer uncertain, his posture no longer divided. Others followed in smaller ways, a pen set down, a tablet lowered. Shoulders easing out of defensive positions into something more open, more receptive. Naomi did not move, her hands still resting lightly against the edge of the table, her breathing slow, even, her presence no longer an interruption but a point of stillness in a room that had finally stopped resisting itself. No one spoke for several seconds, and in that pause, something subtle but profound unfolded. The hierarchy that had defined the room began to blur, not erased, but softened by the simple fact that truth had come from a place it was not expected to. Whitmore exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but deeper than before, his shoulders lowering just enough to signal a shift that words had not yet caught up to. He reached for the printed sheet Naomi had placed on the table, lifting it carefully, not as a dismissal, but as something to be considered, something real. His eyes moved across the lines again, slower this time, no longer searching for contradiction but absorbing what was already there. And for the first time, when he spoke, his voice did not close the room, it opened it. "We will pause the procedure for reassessment," he said, each word deliberate, grounded, not loud, not defensive, just final in a different way, the kind of final that acknowledged change instead of resisting it. The decision landed softly, but its impact spread through the room like a quiet release, tension easing from shoulders, breaths deepening, a few subtle nods passing between doctors who had waited for that exact moment, not for permission, but for alignment with what they now knew to be true. Naomi's gaze lowered briefly to the table, not in submission, but in reflection, the light above catching the edge of her lab coat, the same coat that had drawn quiet laughter minutes ago, now still, unchanged, but seen differently, not as a symbol of place, but as part of the person who had shifted the entire room without raising her voice. Whitmore placed the paper back down with care, his fingers resting on it for a second longer than necessary, as if acknowledging its role. Then his eyes lifted again, meeting Naomi's directly, not with challenge, not with dismissal, but with something quieter, something more human, a recognition that had not been there before. And in that moment, the room did not erupt, did not celebrate, did not speak. It simply held the silence, not empty, but full of understanding, full of the quiet realization that something had changed in a way that could not be undone. The decision settled into the room, like a quiet shift in gravity, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Naomi could feel it in the way no one reached for the coffee anymore, in the way the earlier assumptions had nowhere left to stand. The screen still glowed at the center of the table, numbers unchanged, but now carrying a different weight, no longer background data, but evidence that had redirected everything. Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer, his posture composed but no longer rigid, as if something inside him had recalibrated in silence. He reached for the tablet this time, not out of habit, but with intention, scrolling through the updated guidelines Naomi had referenced, slower than before, absorbing each line instead of scanning past it. The room watched without staring, a subtle shift in attention, not challenging him, not pressuring him, but waiting, not for control, but for acknowledgement. Across the table, the younger doctor folded his hands together, the tension that had once held him back now replaced with a quiet steadiness. Others mirrored it in small ways, a chair pulled closer, a document turned. The meeting no longer divided into ranks, but aligned around something shared. Whitmore finally set the tablet down, the motion deliberate, grounded, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different kind of authority, one that did not need to dominate to be heard. "Dr. Carter," he said, using her name for the first time, not as a correction, not as a test, but as recognition, and the room felt it, subtle, but real. Naomi's gaze lifted slightly, meeting his without hesitation, without triumph, just presence. "Your assessment is correct," he continued, each word measured, not rushed, not forced, but chosen. And the acknowledgement did not echo loudly. It settled, firm and clear. A few doctors nodded openly now, no longer cautious about where they stood, because the direction had been reset. Whitmore leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table, no longer pressing against it. "We will revise the protocol." Immediately, he added, and this time there was no resistance, no hesitation, just quiet agreement spreading through the room. Naomi inclined her head once, not as submission, but as confirmation, her hands still steady, her posture unchanged, because for her, this moment was not about being proven right. It was about the patient, about the life behind the numbers that had almost been overlooked. The screen dimmed slightly as someone adjusted the display, the harsh white light softening just enough to change the tone of the room. Conversations began again, but lower now, more focused, more collaborative, the earlier sharp edges replaced by something more deliberate, more aware. Whitmore's gaze lingered for a second longer, not on the data, but on Naomi, as if understanding that what had shifted was not just the outcome of a single case, but something deeper, something that would not return to what it had been before. And in that quiet continuation of the meeting, with voices steady and aligned, the truth that had entered the room earlier no longer needed to fight for space. It had become the center of it. The meeting did not end abruptly. It transitioned, slowly, like a room relearning how to breathe after holding tension for too long. Voices returned in measured tones, no longer layered with dismissal, but grounded in shared focus. Naomi stepped back slightly from the table, not retreating, just creating space as others leaned in toward the revised data, the screen now, reflecting updated calculations, numbers adjusting, aligning with the correction she had introduced, the glow softer against the glass, less harsh, more precise. Whitmore remained seated for a moment, watching the shift unfold not as something imposed on him, but something he had chosen to allow, and that distinction mattered. He stood then, the movement controlled but without the sharp authority it had carried earlier. Instead, there was a quiet deliberateness to it, as if he was stepping into a different role within the same room. His gaze moved across the table, briefly acknowledging the others, then returned to Naomi, holding there longer this time, not as evaluation, but as recognition fully formed. "Dr. Carter," he said again, his tone steady, but now carrying something that had not been present before, not just acknowledgement, but respect. The word itself settled into the space differently, not as a correction of status, but as an acceptance of it. Naomi inclined her head slightly, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded, not seeking the moment, but receiving it without resistance. Whitmore took a breath, subtle but visible. "You prevented a critical oversight today," he continued, his voice measured, not overly formal, not performative, just direct, and the room listened, not because he demanded it, but because the weight of the statement was shared. That kind of clarity, he added, pausing briefly as if choosing the exact phrasing, is what this board is supposed to represent. The words did not elevate him. They leveled the room, bringing the focus back to purpose rather than position. A few doctors nodded, more openly now, the earlier hierarchy replaced. With a quieter alignment, Naomi's hands rested at her sides now, no longer at the edge of the table, her posture relaxed but still composed, because for her, the moment was not about recognition. It was about what came next. Whitmore reached for the printed guideline again, then set it beside the central documents, integrating it into the official materials rather than leaving it as an exception, a small gesture, but one that carried significance. It meant the correction was not temporary, not situational, but part of the standard moving forward. "We will update the full protocol immediately," he said, and this time the statement did not need reinforcement. It was accepted without question. The room shifted into action, quieter conversations forming, notes being taken, adjustments being made. Naomi turned slightly toward the screen, her eyes scanning the revised figures, confirming without announcing, ensuring the correction held under every angle, because that was where her focus remained, not on the room, not on the acknowledgement, but on the accuracy that had brought her here in the first place. Whitmore's gaze lingered one last time before he turned back to the group, but there was no tension in it now, no resistance, just a quiet understanding that something essential had changed, not only in the outcome of the case, but in the way the room would function from this point forward. And as the meeting continued, steady, aligned, the earlier moment of dismissal faded, replaced by something far more lasting, a shift not announced, not celebrated, but deeply felt. in the way voices carried, in the way attention moved, in the way one person's clarity had quietly redefined the space for everyone. The meeting ended without ceremony. No closing statement, no formal acknowledgement of what had just taken place. Only the quiet shuffle of chairs and the soft hum of devices powering down. Naomi stepped away from the table as others gathered their notes, their movements slower, more thoughtful than when they had entered. The glass door slid open with a faint whisper as people began to exit, one by one. Their conversations low, focused, no longer filled with assumption but with intent. She remained for a moment longer, her gaze drifting back to the screen now dimmed to a soft glow. The corrected figures still visible, steady, precise. The kind of clarity that did not demand attention but held it. Her reflection faintly mirrored in the glass. Lab coat slightly worn at the edges, unchanged from when she had walked in, yet no longer carrying the same meaning in the eyes of those who had seen her stand, speak, and remain. Behind her, the room emptied gradually until only a few remained, Whitmore among them, standing near the head of the table, not at it, his posture less rigid, his presence quieter, as if he too was adjusting to a space that no longer required him to dominate it. He did not call out to her immediately, did not interrupt the stillness that had settled, but after a moment, his voice came, measured. "Dr. Carter," he said, not to command attention, but to share it. Naomi turned slightly, meeting his gaze with the same calm steadiness she had held throughout. There was no tension between them now, no unspoken challenge, only a quiet understanding that had replaced everything else. Whitmore inclined his head just enough to be noticed, not a gesture of authority, but of acknowledgement, and for a brief second, neither spoke, because nothing more was needed to define what had already been understood. Naomi nodded once in return, simple, unembellished, then turned toward the door, her steps measured, unhurried, the sound of her shoes soft against the polished floor. The hallway beyond was brighter, natural light filtering through tall windows, warming the otherwise sterile lines of the building. Nurses passed by with steady purpose, monitors beeped faintly in distant rooms, life continuing in quiet rhythm. The reason all of it existed. She moved through it without pause, her focus already shifting forward, toward the work that remained, toward the patients whose names were more important than any title in a room. Behind her, through the glass, the boardroom stood still, no longer tense, no longer divided, just a space that had been altered in a way that would not be easily reversed. Whitmore watched her leave for a moment longer, before turning back to the table, his hand resting briefly on the documents she had corrected, then lifting away, not to claim them, but to accept what they now represented. Outside, Naomi slowed slightly near a wall of polished metal, where names and titles were engraved in clean, sharp lines. Her eyes passed over them without stopping, because she did not need to read them to know where she stood. The light caught the edge of her coat again, reflecting softly,